Ever wondered what happens when someone with a plastic badge tries to flex on the wrong person? Well, I didn't either until it happened to me. Picture this: a sunny afternoon, me in gym shorts and a ratty t-shirt, covered in dirt from planting. A garden, when suddenly there's a convoy of SUVs pulling up to my house like they're about to conduct a SWAT raid. Little did they know they were about to have the most embarrassing day of their lives, and I was about to have the most satisfying moment of mine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name's Jack Reynolds, and I've been the sheriff of Oakwood County for almost a decade now. Not that you'd know it if you saw me off duty. I'm just a regular guy who lives in a modest home in Meadowbrook Estates, a quiet suburban neighborhood about 30 minutes outside of Nashville. I moved here after my wife Diana passed away from cancer 3 years ago, needed a fresh start, somewhere peaceful where I could raise our son Tyler without the constant reminders of what we'd lost. Tyler's 16 now, a good kid with a sharp mind and a quiet determination that reminds me so much of his mother. His passion is astronomy, always has been. Ever since he was little, he'd drag me outside at ridiculous hours to look at meteor showers or planetary alignments. Diana used to joke that he was born looking at the stars instead of her face. As he grew older, his interest only deepened, and he started saving for a serious telescope, the kind that could photograph deep space objects. When Tyler finally saved enough money for his dream telescope, I promised him we'd build a small observatory in our backyard. Nothing fancy, just a shed with a retractable roof where he could set up his equipment and study the night sky without having to break everything down each time. I knew it would mean the world to him, especially now that he was applying to colleges with strong astronomy programs. The thing about Meadowbrook Estates, it has a homeowners association, and not just any HOA, but one run by Brenda Chambers, a woman who treats suburban bylaws like they're the Constitution, and herself like she's the Supreme Court. From the moment I moved in, Brenda had issues with me. My grass was half an inch too tall. My mailbox was the wrong shade of black. My garbage can stayed at the curb 20 minutes after collection. Every infraction, no matter how small, warranted a formal letter and sometimes a personal visit. But I never took it personally. As sheriff, I've dealt with all types of people, and I've learned that sometimes folks just need to feel like they have control over something. So I nodded politely, fixed whatever needed fixing, and went about my business. That approach worked fine until the day I decided to build Tyler's observatory. I did everything by the book, submitted the plans to the HOA Architectural Committee, got the necessary permits from the county, even went door to door to let my immediate neighbors know what I was planning. The committee approved it, albeit with so many conditions that the approval letter was 4 pages long. But it was approved, and that's what mattered. Construction started on a Saturday in early June. I took 2 weeks of vacation time to build it myself. Tyler helped when he wasn't at his summer job, and a buddy from the department came by a few times to lend a hand with the trickier parts. By the end of the first week, we had the foundation poured and the frame up. It was coming along beautifully, and Tyler couldn't stop grinning every time he looked at it. Then came that Tuesday afternoon. I was alone, working on the roof mechanism, sweaty and dirty but making good progress. I had music playing from a small speaker, not loud enough to bother anyone, just enough to keep me company. That's when I heard the cars pulling up. 3 SUVs, all black, all polished to a shine, parked. In front of my house, the doors opened, and out stepped 5 people in matching navy blue polo shirts with Meadowbrook Estates security embroidered on the chest. They wore khaki pants, sunglasses, and, I couldn't believe my eyes, fake badges hanging around their necks. Leading the pack was Brenda Chambers herself, clipboard in hand, her blonde bob haircut not moving an inch despite the summer breeze. She marched up to my property line like a general inspecting troops. "Mr. Reynolds," she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone that somehow managed to be both sickly sweet and dripping with disdain. "We need to discuss this unauthorized construction immediately." I climbed down from the roof, wiping my hands on my shorts. "Afternoon, Brenda. What seems to be the problem? I've got all my paperwork in order." She sniffed disapprovingly. "Our records show no such approval. This structure violates multiple HOA covenants and must be demolished immediately." One of her security personnel, a middle-aged man with a belly straining against his polo shirt, stepped forward. "Sir, we're going to have to ask you to cease construction activities immediately." I looked at the man, then at the fake badge hanging from his neck. It wasn't even a good fake. Looked like something ordered off a Halloween costume website. "And you are?" "Greg Wilkins, head of Meadowbrook Estates Security and Covenant Enforcement." He puffed out his chest as he said it, like he was introducing himself as the director of the FBI. Now I should mention that Meadowbrook Estates doesn't have a security force. There's a neighborhood watch program, sure, and the HOA sometimes contracts with a private security company to drive through a few times a night. But there's no official security and covenant enforcement team. "Right," I said, trying not to laugh. "Well, Greg, I've got county permits and HOA approval for this structure, so unless there's been some kind of mistake, I'm going to get back to work." Brenda's face hardened. "There's been no mistake, Mr. Reynolds. As president of the HOA, I can assure you that this monstrosity was never approved." I sighed, already tired of the conversation. "Let me get my paperwork." As I turned toward the house, Greg called out, "Sir, do not walk away when we're addressing you." I paused, turning back slowly. "Excuse me?" Greg took another step forward, now standing at the edge of my property. His hand rested on his belt where, I kid you not, he had a holstered taser. "As a representative of Meadowbrook Estates Security, I'm instructing you to remain where you are." That's when things started getting weird. The other security personnel began to spread out, positioning themselves around my yard like they were setting up a perimeter. One of them, a younger guy who looked barely out of his 20s, was filming everything on his phone. "Okay," I said, raising my hand slightly, more in disbelief than compliance. "What exactly is happening here?" Brenda stepped forward, seemingly emboldened by her security detail. "What's happening, Mr. Reynolds, is that you're in violation of multiple HOA covenants. This structure exceeds the maximum allowed height for accessory buildings, the materials don't match the aesthetic guidelines of our community, and the placement interferes with the neighborhood sightlines." "All of which," I replied calmly, "was addressed in my application and subsequently approved by your architectural committee. I have the signed documentation inside." "Produce it!" Greg demanded, his hand still resting on his taser. I stared at him for a long moment. "Are you seriously threatening me with a taser on my own property?" The young guy filming piped up. "Sir, we're just enforcing the covenants that you agreed to when you purchased property in Meadowbrook Estates." I had to laugh at that. "Kid, you don't even know what you're saying, and for the record, none of you have any legal authority to enforce anything." That seemed to hit a nerve with Greg. His face flushed red, and he pulled out a small booklet from his back pocket. "Under Section 7, Paragraph C of the Meadowbrook Estates Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions, the HOA has the right to appoint security personnel to enforce community standards." "Sure," I agreed. "You can hire licensed security guards. What you can't do is pretend to be law enforcement, which is exactly what you're doing with those fake badges." Brenda's eyes narrowed. "Our badges represent our authority within the community, Mr. Reynolds. They are not intended to imply law enforcement status." "Really?" I asked. because they look an awful lot like sheriff's department badges. In fact, they look like cheap knockoffs of my department's badges. There was a brief moment of confusion on their faces. "Your department?" Greg asked, his confidence faltering slightly. I was about to explain when Brenda cut in. "Mr. Reynolds, your occupation is irrelevant to this situation. What matters is that you're in violation of HOA regulations, and we're here to address it." "By what? Tasering me if I don't comply?" I asked. Greg's hand moved slightly away from his taser, but his stance remained confrontational. "We're authorized to detain individuals who pose a threat to community standards until proper authorities can arrive." That's when I lost it, not in anger, but in laughter. Full-on, bent-over, tears in my eyes laughter. The absurdity of the situation was just too much. "Something funny, Mr. Reynolds?" Brenda asked, her voice sharp with indignation. I straightened up, wiping my eyes. "Yeah, actually, the proper authorities are already here." I walked over to my truck, which was parked in the driveway, and pulled out my wallet from the center console. I flipped it open to reveal my badge and ID card. Sheriff Jack Reynolds. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Oakwood County Sheriff's Department. Now, would you like to explain to me why you're impersonating law enforcement officers on my property? The color drained from Greg's face so fast I thought he might pass out. The young guy lowered his phone. The other security personnel started taking small steps backward toward their vehicles. Brenda, however, wasn't so easily deterred. "This changes nothing, Sheriff Reynolds. Your position doesn't exempt you from HOA regulations." "You're absolutely right," I agreed. "It doesn't. But it does mean I know exactly what constitutes impersonating a law enforcement officer under state law." I pointed to the badges hanging around their necks. Those are illegal. And that taser you're carrying without proper licensing or training, also illegal. Greg's hand moved completely away from his belt now. "These are just symbolic representations of our—" "Save it," I cut him off. "I've been in law enforcement for 20 years. I know what you're trying to do here, and it stops now." I turned to address all of them. "Here's what's going to happen. You're all going to remove those fake badges and leave them here with me. Greg, you're going to surrender that taser. Then you're all going to get in your vehicles and leave my property immediately. If you do that, we can pretend this little encounter never happened." "And if we don't?" Brenda challenged, though. Her voice had lost some of its edge. I smiled, but there was no humor in it. "Then I make some calls, and we do this officially. Impersonating law enforcement is a Class E felony in this state. That means up to 6 years in prison and fines up to $3,000 per person. Your choice." The silence that followed was deafening. Greg was the first to break, removing his badge and placing it on my lawn. The others followed suit, casting nervous glances at each other. Greg hesitated with the taser until Brenda gave him a sharp nod, at which point he reluctantly unholstered it and set it down as well. "This isn't over," Brenda said, her voice quiet but filled with venom. "The HOA board will be hearing about this." "I'm counting on it," I replied, "because I'll be filing a formal complaint about this entire incident. And Brenda, if you or your security theater troupe ever try something like this again, I won't be so understanding." They retreated to their vehicles, dignity in tatters, and drove away much slower than they had arrived. I collected the fake badges and the taser from my lawn, shaking my head at the absurdity of it all. When they were out of sight, I pulled out my phone and called my deputy chief, Mark. "Hey, Jack, how's the observatory coming along?" he asked when he picked up. "Interesting story," I replied. "I just had the HOA's self-appointed security force try to detain me for building it, complete with fake badges and an illegal taser." Mark's laughter came through the speaker. "You're kidding. Wish I was. Listen, I'm gonna need you to run some checks on a Gregory Wilkins. See if he's got any priors, especially anything related to impersonating officers or illegal weapons. Possession. Will do. You want to file charges? I thought about it for a moment. Not yet. Let's see what we find first. But I want this documented officially. Can you send someone over to take my statement and collect these badges as evidence? On. Wilson's in that area. I'll have him swing by in about 20 minutes. I thanked him and hung up, staring at the half-finished observatory. Tyler would be home from work soon, and I didn't want this nonsense to dampen his excitement about our project. But I also knew this wasn't over. Brenda Chambers wasn't the type to admit defeat, even when she was clearly in the wrong. Sure enough, by the time Officer Wilson had taken my statement and collected the badges and taser as evidence, my email inbox had a new message from the HOA board. It was a formal cease and desist order claiming that my observatory project violated multiple covenants and demanding immediate demolition of all construction. Attached to the email was a single document, a denial of my application from the architectural committee dated 3 weeks ago. It was a forgery, and not even a good one. The signature of the committee chair was clearly different from the one on my approval letter, and the form itself used an outdated template that the HOA had replaced last year. I forwarded the email to Mark with a brief note. Looks like we can add forgery to the list. His response came a few minutes later. Wilkins has 2 priors for impersonating security personnel, both misdemeanors because he didn't specifically claim to be law enforcement. He's walking a very thin line. Also, no permit for that taser. I was still processing this information when Tyler's bus dropped him off. He bounded up the driveway, full of teenage energy, despite having worked a 6-hour shift at the local grocery store. "How's it going?" he asked, eyes immediately going to the observatory. "Looks like you got a lot done today." I forced a smile, not wanting to burden him with the day's drama. "Making progress. Want to help me with the roof mechanism after dinner?" His face lit up. "Definitely." As we worked that evening, I kept the conversation light, focusing on the project and Tyler's excitement about using his telescope. But inside, my mind was churning with plans for dealing with Brenda and her fake security force. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about protecting my community from people who thought they could use intimidation and lies to get their way. The next morning, I made some calls. First to the county permit office to confirm my permits were still valid, they were, then to a lawyer friend who specialized in property law. She listened to my story with increasing disbelief. "They did what?" she asked when I finished. "With fake badges and a taser? Jack, that's so far beyond the scope of HOA authority. It's not even in the same universe." "I know," I replied. "What I need to know is how to shut this down definitively. I don't want them pulling this stunt with anyone else in the neighborhood." "Document everything," she advised. "Every interaction, every email, every piece of paper they send you. And Jack, don't demolish anything. Keep building according to your approved plans and permits. If they escalate, we can file for an injunction to prevent HOA interference." I thanked her and hung up, feeling more confident about my position. I spent the rest of the morning working on the observatory, half expecting Brenda's security theater to make another appearance. They didn't, but I noticed several slow drive-bys from unfamiliar cars, occupants clearly taking photos of my property. By lunchtime, word had spread through the neighborhood about the confrontation. My next-door neighbor, Ellen, brought over a plate of cookies for fortification and shared that Brenda had been pulling similar stunts with other homeowners, though never quite so dramatically. Last month, she threatened the Martinez family with daily fines because their daughter's wheelchair ramp didn't match the approved color palette for the neighborhood, Ellen told me, shaking her head in disgust. They ended up painting it, even though it should be covered under accessibility exceptions. That piece of information struck a chord with me. If Brenda was systematically targeting vulnerable homeowners with her intimidation tactics, this was about more than just my observatory. This was about abuse of power. I decided it was time to play offense rather than defense. As sheriff, I had resources and knowledge that other homeowners didn't. And while I couldn't use my official position to fight a personal battle, I could certainly ensure that the law was being followed by everyone. That afternoon, I made another call, this time to the state licensing board that oversees private security personnel. I reported Greg Wilkins and his team for operating without proper licensing and impersonating law enforcement. I followed up with an email detailing the incident and attaching photos of the fake badges that Officer Wilson had taken as evidence. I also reached out to several other homeowners who had reportedly faced similar intimidation tactics, including the Martinez family. Many were reluctant to speak up, fearing HOA retaliation, but a few agreed to share their experiences. With each conversation, a pattern emerged. Brenda targeted those she perceived as unlikely to fight back: single parents, elderly residents, immigrants, and in my case, a relatively new homeowner she hadn't yet realized was in law enforcement. Her security team would show up, flash their fake badges, and make threats ranging from fines to property liens to even calls to immigration authorities in some cases. It was systematic intimidation, plain and simple, and it had been going on for years. By the end of the day, I had compiled enough evidence to justify a formal investigation, not as a homeowner with a grudge, but as the county sheriff responding to multiple credible reports of criminal activity. I assigned 2 deputies to the case and instructed them to proceed by the book: interviews, evidence collection, and proper documentation of everything. Meanwhile, I continued building the observatory, working evenings and weekends around my regular duties. Tyler was thrilled with the progress, already planning where he would position his telescope and what celestial objects he would photograph first. A week after the confrontation, my deputies had completed their initial investigation. The evidence was damning. Forged documents, unlicensed security personnel, illegal weapons, and a pattern of intimidation that stretched back to when Brenda first became HOA president 3 years ago. But the real bombshell came when they dug into the HOA's financial records, which were public documents due to the association's tax status. Over the past 2 years, nearly $75,000 had been paid to Meadowbrook Security Services, a company registered to none other than Gregory Wilkins, with Brenda Chambers listed as a silent partner. The company had no legitimate security licenses, no trained personnel, and apparently existed solely to intimidate homeowners and funnel HOA funds into Brenda's and Greg's pockets. Armed with this information, I called a meeting with the district attorney. She reviewed the evidence and agreed that there were grounds for multiple criminal charges: fraud, impersonating law enforcement, forgery, operating an unlicensed security company, and conspiracy to commit all of the above. This goes beyond HOA overreach, she said, closing the file. This is a criminal enterprise masquerading as community governance. We'll move forward with charges. 2 days later, Brenda Chambers and Gregory Wilkins were arrested at an HOA board meeting, led away in handcuffs in front of the very homeowners they had been intimidating for years. The other security personnel were brought in for questioning, and most quickly turned on Brenda and Greg in exchange for reduced charges. The story made the local news, complete with images of the fake badges and quotes from homeowners who had been victimized. The remaining HOA board members, most of whom claimed ignorance of the scheme, though I had my doubts, issued a public apology and promised a complete overhaul of the association's practices. As for my observatory, it was completed 3 weeks after the arrests, exactly according to the approved plans. The first night it was operational, Tyler spent hours photographing Jupiter and its moons. his face glowing with excitement in the dim light of his computer screen. "This is amazing, Dad," he said, not taking his eyes off the monitor. "I can see details I never could before." I stood behind him, a hand on his shoulder, feeling a deep satisfaction that went beyond just completing a building project. This observatory represented something more, a stand against bullies, a defense of our home and community, and most importantly, a safe space for my son to pursue his passion. In the months that followed, both Brenda and Greg pleaded guilty to reduced charges. They each received probation, community service, and were ordered to pay restitution to the HOA for the misappropriated funds. The HOA itself underwent a complete restructuring, with new bylaws that limited its power and required transparency in all decisions. I was asked to join the new board multiple times but declined. My job was to enforce the law, not homeowners' covenants. However, I did agree to consult on the security aspects, ensuring that any future security measures would be legitimate, necessary, and lawfully implemented. The Martinez family's wheelchair ramp was officially exempted from color requirements under the Fair Housing Act, and several other homeowners who had been forced to make unnecessary and expensive modifications to their properties were compensated from the recovered funds. As for Tyler, his observatory became somewhat of a neighborhood attraction. On clear nights, he would invite interested neighbors over for informal stargazing sessions, sharing his knowledge and passion for astronomy with children and adults alike. Those gatherings evolved into a monthly astronomy night that brought the community together in a way HOA meetings never could. Looking back now, that confrontation in my yard was a turning point, not just for me and Tyler, but for our entire neighborhood. It exposed corruption that had been hidden behind officiousness and intimidation, and it created space for a more inclusive and fair community to emerge. And every time I look at the observatory in our backyard, I'm reminded that sometimes standing your ground isn't just about defending your rights. It's about protecting everyone's right to feel safe and respected in their own homes. That's something worth building, no matter how many obstacles stand in the way. The fallout from Brenda and Greg's arrest was immediate. News spread through Meadowbrook Estates like wildfire, with neighbors calling, texting, and stopping by to share their own HOA horror stories. Some tales were minor annoyances, disputes over holiday decorations or garden gnomes, but others revealed a disturbing pattern of targeted harassment against homeowners who couldn't easily fight back. The Ellis family, an elderly couple in their 80s, admitted they'd been paying $200 monthly special assessments directly to Brenda for supposed violations they couldn't even understand. The Patels had been threatened with deportation proceedings if they didn't repaint their front door from teal to navy blue. The Washingtons had been blocked from installing solar panels through fabricated rejections of properly submitted paperwork. I documented each case methodically, adding them to the growing file for the district attorney. With each new story, my anger deepened. This wasn't just about money anymore, though the financial fraud was substantial. This was about a systematic campaign to control and intimidate an entire community. 3 weeks after the arrests, I received a call from Patricia Morgan, the interim HOA president. She'd been on the board for years, but claimed she had no knowledge of Brenda's schemes. I had my doubts, but I agreed to meet her at the community center to discuss next steps. "Sheriff Reynolds," she began, hands folded primly on the table between us. "On behalf of the board, I want to express our profound apologies for what happened. We had no idea about the security force or the financial improprieties." I nodded, but said nothing, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably. "We're conducting a full audit," she continued, shifting in her seat, "and we've discovered that the situation is worse than we initially thought." She slid a folder across the table. Inside were bank statements showing nearly $300,000 in HOA funds diverted to shell companies over the past 5 years, far more than my investigation had uncovered. "There's more," Patricia said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "We found a list on Brenda's computer, residents ranked by compliance probability. Those at the bottom, people she thought wouldn't or couldn't fight back, were targeted for escalating enforcement. Your name was recently added with a note that said, 'Potential troublemaker. Needs special handling.'" I couldn't help but laugh at that. Special handling, that's one way to put it. Patricia didn't share my amusement. "There's something else you should know. The day before she confronted you, Brenda filed a complaint with the County Ethics Board, claiming you were abusing your position as sheriff to circumvent HOA regulations. That explained the urgency of their approach. Brenda was trying to establish a pattern of defiance before her complaint was investigated. The complaint has been withdrawn," Patricia added hastily, "and we've sent a formal letter clarifying that it was filed under false pretenses." I leaned back in my chair, studying her face. "What happens now, Patricia? How do you prevent another Brenda from taking over?" Her answer surprised me. "We're dissolving the HOA." The community vote was nearly unanimous. After seeing the evidence of corruption and hearing testimony from victimized neighbors, residents overwhelmingly supported replacing the HOA with a simpler community association. One with limited powers, transparent finances, and no enforcement authority. Tyler's observatory became a focal point of the new community spirit. On clear nights, neighbors would gather in our backyard, taking turns looking through his telescope while he excitedly explained what they were seeing. Kids who had never shown interest in science were suddenly pestering their parents for astronomy books and star charts. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very structure Brenda had fought so hard to prevent had become the thing that brought the neighborhood together. 6 months after the arrests, both Brenda and Greg accepted plea deals. Neither would serve jail time, but the financial penalties were severe, and both were barred from serving on any HOA board or working in any security capacity in the future. The day after the sentencing, I received an unexpected visitor. Greg. Wilkins stood on my porch, shoulders slumped, a far cry from the puffed-up security chief who had threatened me with a taser. "Sheriff Reynolds," he began, unable to meet my eyes. "I came to apologize. What I did, was wrong." I crossed my arms, waiting for him to continue. "I was a mall security guard for 20 years, he said. "Always wanted to be a real cop, but couldn't pass the psych evaluation. When Brenda offered me the chance to head up her security team, to have some real authority." He trailed off, then shook his head. "That's no excuse. I knew what we were doing wasn't right." I studied him for a long moment. "Did you know about the financial fraud?" He nodded miserably. "Not at first. By the time I figured it out, I was in too deep. Brenda had evidence of me threatening homeowners. Said she'd make sure I went to jail if I didn't play along. Part of me wanted to tell him to get off my property, but another part, the part that had spent decades in law enforcement, recognized genuine remorse when I saw it." "What will you do now?" I asked. "Community service starts next week. After that, I'm moving in with my sister in Arizona. Fresh start." He paused. "I really am sorry, especially for what we tried to pull with your son's observatory. Kid's got a real gift, from what I hear." I nodded, surprised by the genuine admiration in his voice. "He does." As Greg walked away, I felt an unexpected sense of closure. The damage Brenda had done to our community was real, but so was the healing that had begun. That night, Tyler hosted another stargazing session. As I watched him patiently explaining the rings of Saturn to the Martinez's daughter, who was beaming from her wheelchair, I had a sudden realization. Sometimes it takes a confrontation with the worst of humanity to bring out the best in a community. The observatory that Brenda had tried so hard to stop hadn't just given Tyler a place to pursue his passion. It had become a gathering place where neighbors became friends, where differences faded beneath the shared wonder of the night sky. A year after that confrontation in my yard, Meadowbrook Estates looks different. The imposing HOA signs at the entrance have been replaced with a simple welcome. The rule book that once ran to 47 pages has been replaced by a single-page community guideline that basically amounts to be considerate. Gardens are more diverse, houses more colorful, and residents more connected. Tyler was accepted to a prestigious astronomy program with a full scholarship. At his graduation party, nearly every family from the neighborhood showed up to celebrate. As I watched him chatting excitedly about his future plans, surrounded by people who genuinely cared about him, I couldn't help but think about how differently things might have turned out. If Brenda had just accepted my approved plans, she might still be running her scheme. If I had backed down that day, other homeowners might still be living in fear. If we hadn't built that observatory, our community might still be divided by rigid rules and petty enforcement. Sometimes standing your ground isn't just about winning a fight. It's about creating space for something better to grow in the aftermath. And sometimes, the most important thing a sheriff can do isn't enforcing the law, but reminding people that no badge, real or fake, gives anyone the right to bully others. As for me, I still live in the same house, still serve as sheriff, and still help Tyler maintain his observatory, even though he's away at college. But I've changed too. I pay more attention to the small injustices, the everyday abuses of power that might otherwise fly under the radar. And I remind myself daily that authority without compassion isn't authority at all. It's just intimidation, wearing a uniform. The fake badges that Brenda's team wore that day are mounted in a shadow box in my office now. Not as trophies, but as reminders of how easily power can be counterfeited and how important it is to use real authority wisely. It's a lesson I carry with me every time I put on my own badge, a lesson about service, community, and standing up for what's right, even when you're covered in dirt and wearing gym shorts. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.